Katie Benner, it's an amazing piece of reporting. I'm going to ask you to take us through it. My first thought was that in some ways it bookends two other points of sort of public-facing information about what this committee has. One is Luke Broadwater's great reporting shortly after the insurrection about a half a dozen Republican members who had known associations and appearances with some of the very same extremist groups who are under scrutiny. Many of those members have been charged. And the other being the text messages themselves that Liz Cheney read and that you and your colleagues obviously had some access to. Tell me about what this piece of reporting adds to our understanding.
So between the reporting that Luke had done, other reporters, and then, of course, the documents that were turned over to the committee, we were able to start making inquiries about just how deep the ties between some of the members of the Freedom Caucus and these efforts to, what they called Stop the Steal, how deep those ties really were. Of course, we saw in the moment after the election, in those weeks and months, that these members were very vocal at rallies and on TV about casting doubt on the results of the election and about perpetuating conspiracy theories. But what we wanted to understand was, who were they doing this with? Were they acting on their own? Several of them had already, gone to great pains to defend Trump during the Russian investigation, was just more of the same. And what we found was that there was a lot of coordination with Mark Meadows, their former Freedom Caucus colleague, not a huge surprise. But in his role as chief of staff, you would think that that would not be something that he would be doing. He should be trying to figure out what, the priorities of the administration. He shouldn't be trying to work with his former colleagues to, stop or overturn the results of the elections. And that they were also working with members of Stop the Steal. They were working with other White House officials like Kayleigh McEnany and Stephen Miller on things like messaging and how best to perpetuate these rumors, these unfounded conspiracy theories that Donald Trump had perhaps won the election. So the coordination is what we really found ran deeper than what we had thought before.
Katie, you also dispel any notion that Mark Meadows was a sort of hapless break on Trump's worst impulses in the mold of Reince Priebus or John Kelly, who seemed to want to try to keep the lunacy out of the Oval Office and failed. Mark Meadows seemed to have been the architect of harnessing the lunacy, the white supremacist-aligned militia groups, the most fervent members of Congress, and using them as a cudgel against the United States Department of Justice. Talk about that part of the reporting.
Sure. So it's pretty clear that there was really nothing that was happening during that time that Meadows himself was not at least aware of or apprised of. So, for example, 2 days after the election is called for Joseph Biden. So when that happens in November, 2 days later on November 9th, there's a meeting at Trump headquarters in Virginia, Trump campaign headquarters, and you see Stephen Miller, Kayleigh McEnany, Ronna McDaniel, head of the RNC, and others sitting down and saying, how are we going to message this idea that Trump still could win and still could be president? You see two members of Congress, Jim Jordan and Scott Perry, both representatives from Ohio and Pennsylvania respectively, really helping to shape that messaging. And then during the lunchtime break, when Meadows comes in, they brief him and let him know what's going on. Mark Meadows is in the middle of everything. Now, we saw in other reporting in the Washington Post, which has been extraordinary, and in some of the books that have come out about the final days of the Trump administration, that Meadows was always trying to basically argue that he was put a check on Trump's worst impulses. He was saying to people in Pence's office, he was saying to more mainstream Republicans, I think we can figure out a way for this to end peaceably. I'm sure that the president will come to understand that he's lost this election. But what you see is this duality. One face saying, we're going to do the reasonable thing, and another working with the president's allies to stoke his very worst impulses.
Dan, I'm going to read the part of the story that details what Katie Benner is describing to all of us. Mr. Perry and Mr. Jordan huddled with senior White House officials, including Meadows, Stephen Miller, top Trump advisor Bill Stepien, the campaign manager, and Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary. According to two people familiar with the meetings, which have not been previously reported, the group settled on a strategy that would become a blueprint for Trump's supporters in Congress, hammer home the idea that the election was tainted, announce legal actions being taken by the campaign, and bolster the case with allegations of fraud. At a news conference later that day, McEnany delivered the message. Quote, "The election is not over," she said, "far from it." Jordan's spokesman said that the meeting was to discuss media strategy, not to overturn the election. Well, I have two questions about this. If the meeting was not to overturn the election, why are all these people in a room talking about the legal, what Rudy Giuliani was going to sort of throw out in court? And why didn't the White House chief of staff, who actually possesses some duality when an incumbent president runs for office, just call over to DOJ and say, and even that would be inappropriate, but these actors knew there was no fraud because Bill Barr had said there was no fraud. I think Chris Krebs had already said that the election had been secure. What questions do these meetings lead you to want to know more about?
Well, first, I think it's remarkable that they had a meeting 2 days after the election, ostensibly to talk about a media strategy that included allegations of fraud. There was no basis for that. It wasn't that they had received allegations of fraud and that they were aware of fraud. That was part of their media strategy, not their legal strategy. So right from the beginning, that this was a corrupt enterprise designed to subvert the election. There are a lot of things in this reporting and other reporting that's coming out recently that's fascinating to think about. First of all, we know that a number of these potential witnesses in the January 6th committee are resisting strongly the possibility that the January 6th committee would get cell phone records of phone calls, just the numbers of text messages and phone calls among the relevant actors. Why is that? Because those are going to show the degree of coordination that exists between and among these 6 members of Congress and Mark Meadows, who was their buddy. When I did the impeachment, Nicole, and we were doing those closed-door depositions and investigations, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, and Scott Perry were the most frequent attendees of the Republican conference. And then they would leave and they would figure out what their messaging strategy is going to be. Mark Meadows was always trying to play both sides. He would get along with everybody, but at the core, he was very deeply close with these men and clearly ultimately was in the center of all of this. So it's just further evidence when you talk about those notes that Richard Donahue says about the R congressman. We know now who those R congressmen is. So the question is, what does the January 6th committee do? Do they subpoena these witnesses? They are very, very important and relevant witnesses to what happened on January 6th. But then you get into an issue, and David can talk to this, of members of Congress as part of a committee subpoenaing other members of Congress. That opens up a whole nother can of worms.
Well, I mean, let me just play the devil's advocate here. If they don't think they did anything wrong, I mean, so what Katie reports is that this was Jim Jordan's spokesman said this to the New York Times. The meeting was to discuss media strategy, not to overturn the election. So the position Jim Jordan's spokesperson has taken on behalf of Jim Jordan is he wasn't involved in a coup. Why wouldn't he call Liz or Adam or Chairman Thompson and ask to go explain that, David Jolly?
Well, Nicole, you're exactly right. And to Daniel's point, there are privileges that exist with members of Congress, much like the President of the United States is trying to exert executive privilege, wrongly or not. But just because you have that privilege or you suggest you might have that privilege doesn't mean you have to use it. And I think that's the question we're in right now, this national moment where people died as a result of trying to undermine a national election. Our democracy was nearly toppled. And it would seem the calling to patriotism is that you share with the investigators what you know. But that's not the position that these Republican members are taking. Nicole, I think what the information that continues to be reported out that the 1-6 committee continues to share continues to affirm that there was a conspiracy to try to cancel the election of 2020. And that conspiracy involved the President of the United States, members of Congress, the White House Chief of Staff. It involved political actors organizing the Stop the Steal rally. This was a multi-pronged effort between actors in the executive branch, actors in the legislative branch, and outside political actors to try to cancel an election for the sole purpose of keeping the current president who had lost in power. Nicole, it was a failed authoritarian coup. There's no other way to describe it. If you have the President of the United States, his chief of staff, sitting members of Congress, possibly the influence of the Department of Justice and the political apparatus of that sitting president trying to cancel a free and fair election to keep him in power, it's a failed authoritarian coup. And I think that's what Liz Cheney knows, and it's why she's starting to lean in more and more on this very important message.